We are very pleased to have you all here with us today. My name is Nell Breyer. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Marshall Scholars, which is an organization, for those who don't know, with about a nearly 2,000 member Marshall Scholar membership that works to strengthen US-UK ties and the Marshall Scholarship. This has historically served as you know, the Transatlantic Alliance has been a linchpin for liberal democracy, prosperity, peace, and important cultural exchange. A valuable thread of this has been the Marshall Scholarship, which is an educational program which strengthens international exchange and advancement in nearly every field of human endeavor. Since the onset of the pandemic, we have made an effort to establish this monthly series, an arts and humanities conversation via webcast, featuring artists and poets, writers and performers in conversations about their creative process, ideas, and their sources of inspiration. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome to the conversation today Nicole Krause, who is a 1996 Marshall Scholar, and she is in conversation with her former Stanford professor, Robert Harrison, where they'll be talking about her latest work, Nicole's latest work, To Be a Man, which is a wonderful compilation of short stories that touch on intimacy, sensuality, closeness, what remains unknown and mysterious, as well as very describable and palpable and almost primordial in our close relationships. We invite you all throughout this conversation to drop your questions into the Q&A function. If you don't know what that is, there's a little box at the top or the bottom of your screen which says Q&A. So please drop those questions in, and the speakers will try to fold your ideas and comments into their conversation throughout the hour. Just by way of introduction, Nicole, as you may know, has written international best-selling novels such as Forest Dark and Great House. She's won numerous prizes in international literature for her work and has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the Orange Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book of the Year, and others. Her fiction has been published in numerous places, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, Esquire, and the Best American Short Stories, and I believe have been translated into 37 languages and counting at this time. She is currently the first writer in residence at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute at Columbia University. And this work, To Be a Man, is her first collection of short stories, was published in November of 2020. She is joined today by her former professor, Robert Harrison, who's the Rossini Pierotti Professor in French and Italian Literature at Stanford University's French and Italian Department. He was knighted as Chevalier by the French Republic, is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a lead guitarist, apparently, for the cerebral rock band Last Wave. Professor Harrison's works have been published extensively since 1988, and a full list of works of his and Nicole's can be found in the chat. Manny Sanchez will kindly put the links to their websites where you can find more of their works. His works have been translated into French, Italian, German, Japanese, Chinese, and many other languages. And he also runs a literary talk show called Entitled Opinions, and is the director of Another Look, a Stanford-based book club. So we are delighted to turn the conversation now over to the two stars of this afternoon, and I will be quiet and let you both take it away. Thank you.
And thank you, Nell, and thank you all for joining. It's a real delight to be back in conversation with Nicole Krause, who was a student of mine back at Stanford when she was an undergraduate. And Nicole, you know, welcome you to the program as well. I know that we have a lot of Stanford people that registered for this conversation. So maybe you could say a word about how you recall your Stanford years and how formative they might have been for you and your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. The Marshall Association, thank you, Robert, for agreeing to be with me today. I feel like my time at Stanford started many conversations that have gone on in my mind until now, are ongoing. And certainly one of those was with you, or encouraged by you and in your presence. we were just talking now before this event began about my recollection of being probably in the class that had the most significance to me in my undergraduate time, which was your class on existentialism. And we read Pirandello, Beckett, and Sartre together. And I hope we'll get to this a little bit later, but I think that there are threads there that you pulled out of those texts that sort of went on shining in my mind for a very long time. And finally, some 20 years later, wove themselves into at least one of my books, if not more. So that was, it was, my undergraduate time at Stanford was an extraordinarily special time. It was a kind of mind-blowing time for me. Certainly, having been a kid who went to public school on Long Island and had like very little access to a lot of things that I suddenly had immediate access to when I arrived at Stanford was extraordinary. And I just want to add one more thing before moving on to, I guess, to say something about being a Marshall as well, right?
Yes.
I should just say that that scholarship to me was just an extraordinary gift. And I had known always since the time I was 14 that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know whether that would ever be a reality. And of course I wanted to be near to literature, as near as possible. So I studied literature, and there was, points in the first year of my Marshall scholarship where I was working, I thought I was going to be working towards a DPhil in English literature. And I found myself on yet another day in the Bodleian Library with a stack of theory books in front of me. And I realized it had been a very long time since I actually read a novel and read poetry. And I realized that if I was going to salvage what was most live in my heart when it came to wanting to write, that I would need to step back from being an academic about literature. And so the Marshall Commission was kind enough to I don't know, break rules or be flexible about rules for me and let me use my second year of funding to really as a gift. And I did a master's at the Courtauld Institute in Dutch 17th century art, which was a class an interest I had begun at Stanford as well in a class there. And I truly knew it was a year of just learning for the sake of learning, for the sake of pleasure and expansion. And that too has gone on reverberating my mind and in my work, I think, for many years. So now I just want to, I think there's a strange glitch as we speak that I'm CU instead of Robert. So I don't know if maybe Manny can fix that while we're talking. But anyway, let's see.
Great. Well, I remember that course well. And I also, maybe we can get into this later, that there is a strong existentialist kind of strain in your, in some of your books, especially To Be a Man. And maybe we can hold that in abeyance for a little bit and maybe take one step back. Before you published To Be a Man this year, this novel that you wrote called Forest Dark, which I read. You actually, that's how we got back in touch with each other, because you sent me a copy of it. And it was, made a real impression on me, because it has, there's a deep well of mystery surrounding, the story and the characters. Not that we need to go into too much detail, but nevertheless, the title also, Forest Dark, comes from Longfellow's translation of the first tercet of Dante's Divine Comedy. In the middle of our life's way, I found myself lost in a forest dark, as he puts it, selva oscura, in which the straight way was lost. And that forest is it's a kind of midpoint. We know that Dante was 35 years of age in 1300, which is the year in which this journey through the afterlife takes place. And so the banal interpretation of the midpoint in one's life is that it's halfway in the kind of biblical 70 years average lifespan. But we know that these kind of midpoints can happen at any point in one's life, because they are moments of crisis where the path you have been on leads to a kind of dead end. And that the only way to move forward is to turn somehow. So the midpoint is a turning point. And this can happen, I think that there are characters, even children, in your collection of stories, To Be a Man, in the last story, maybe we can talk more about that, where the son, you know, you're speaking about it, the character's son is wondering, when is he going to, you know, break out of boyhood? Will he ever become a man as such? And so, and these turning points seem to be moments of crisis and conversion, in the literal sense of turning oneself around. And metanoia is the Greek word for that, changing one's mindset and changing, you know, one's life. And so many of your characters go through this experience of bewilderment in a forest-like environment that calls for transformation. And what really struck me in Forest Dark is the way that, as your character Nicole says, you know, you have to step into the pain, not in order to overcome it, but to allow the pain, whatever the nature of that pain is, to allow that pain to transform, you know, one's perception and relation to the real. And in that sense, the forest, it's not a place that you overcome, but you learn to inhabit it in a way that, you know, gives it much more density as a space. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, many things about that. I mean, I think, first of all, I should also say that I took my class on the Divine Comedy at Stanford as well with Jeffrey Schnapp. So I'm sure that there, you know, the thinking of this began there too. But you know, I was 38 when I started Forest Dark, 37 or 38. And so in age, even if our lifespans have now been extended, I sort of aligned with Dante in that. But I like the idea that you have located this possibility for becoming lost, and kind of breaking down of the breaking down of old forms as something that could happen at any time in life. Because I think as a writer, and I'm not alone in this, I mean, perhaps all writers are drawn to the moment in which a character hits a wall, the wall of where her own principles or assumptions or perceptions, beliefs about herself and others in the world no longer can carry her forward. And some breakdown of that wall has to occur, some new direction has to be found to continue on. And that can either be a paralyzing moment, but in life, it is often a paralyzing moment, but in literature, it can be a moment of access to transcendence, to transformation. And I think, you know, that may be a very American optimistic, you know, idea. I guess there are other literatures in which we end at the wall, you know, and there's no going around it, and there's no transformation. But I am drawn to that kind of, that moment of release into new freedom. And I'm drawn to it over and over and over again. I also want to say something in particular about that forest too, because, you know, your book on forests, which is really a kind of meditation on the history of the forests in Western imagination, really, it was published. I just checked the year that I started at Stanford in 1992. I can't remember when I actually read it. It was sometime as an undergraduate, maybe around the time that I took your class. But, you know, there you lay out this sense of this long history of what the forest represents in our Western imagination. And of course it stands in opposition to all of the forms of creating order that civilization offers us, right? Religion, family, laws, and so on and so forth. I thought I would just for those who are listening and might not know the book, I just want to read a couple of lines from Robert's preface. So he says, if forests appear in our religions as places of profanity, they also appear as sacred. If they have typically been considered places of lawlessness, they have also provided havens for those who took up the cause of justice and fought the law's corruption. If they evoke associations of danger and abandon in our minds, they also evoke scenes of enchantment. In other words, in the religions, mythologies, and literatures of the West, the forest appears as a place where the logic of distinction goes astray. or where our subjective categories are confounded. And then you end this preface most beautifully. You say that you're often asked for where the idea came from. And instead of actually giving an answer, which most writers feel forced to do, you say, I actually don't know. But your best guess is that when you went to go visit the poet Zanzotto in Italy, he took you to Selva Antica, an ancient forest. And you say there, and then I perhaps realized that the forest and its enduring antiquity was the correlate of the poet's memory. And that once its remnants were gone, the poet would fall into oblivion. And so I think, this idea of the forest is a place where we go to get lost, which exists outside of law and order, but is a place where we also can become enchanted. We can refashion ourselves. We can refine ourselves. Obviously drew me very, very deeply, and maybe took 20 years of meditation till it finally arose again in my thinking in Forest Dark, along with a number of other strands of ideas which got braided together there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Can I follow up then on the forest, because in going back to Dante one last time, when he's there lost in the forest, it's actually he's saved from his predicament by the appearance of a ghost of a person who has been dead for 1,300 years, namely the Roman poet Virgil. And Virgil becomes his guide through Inferno and Purgatory. And this seems to suggest that in moments of crisis, sometimes it's in order to move forward, you also have to take a step back into legacy, heritage, into a conversation with the dead somehow. And I know that in Forest Dark, the novel, both of the main characters are in some ways on a kind of quest for what would be ancestry, what would be a tradition with its deep history, its associations with Israel in that case, and other kind of legacies where the Nicole character is in also coming to terms with the legacy of Franz Kafka. How much of your work do you see as an act of retrieval in terms of cultural memories or legacies that are specific to your own identity, existential identity, cultural, even ethnic or national, in your fiction?
Are we back? Okay. Yeah. There was I don't know, so you froze for a second. It might be my connection. I don't know whose connection is. Anyway, so it's an interesting question. I think, in Forest Dark, you have two characters, one an older man, Jules Epstein, who's 68, and one, this writer, Nicole, who's she's, I think, just about to turn 40. And both of them are, you're right, I mean, they're on a kind of search. They're seeking something. The old order no longer works for them. For Epstein, is a turning away from his profound sort of addiction to or belief in materialism, the material world, toward that which he, in a sense, neglected, the spiritual realm. And in Nicole, there's a sense in which the form she's chosen as perhaps wife or mother or even novelist are somehow too narrow. They need to be splintered in order to be reforged. And I think both of them find their Virgil, right? There's Epstein encounters this Rabbi Klausner, and we never quite know whether he's a kind of a crook or crazy, or whether he has genius in him. But in some way, he does help to direct or pilot Epstein toward this leaping off into a more mystical way, a turning toward wonder, away from the known and all that's knowable, to face and feel filled with the awe of the unknown, right? Which he's never done all his life. And with Nicole, there's this encounter with this character, Friedman, who may or may not be a professor of literature, retired professor of literature at Tel Aviv University, or may not be a former Mossad, but he directs Nicole, he becomes her Virgil and guides her towards what he, in some sense, what he wants of her, but she refuses that and she finds what she needs. I think in both cases, the question of the past is relevant and interesting. I mean, they both go to Israel, which holds, some 3,000 more years of, Jewish history. And the question of how much the burden of that history weighs on both or gives both access is certainly a subject in the novel. I think for Nicole, when Friedman says to her, look, you're writing this long line of Jewish writers that go back to the original writers of the Torah, and you're adding to the Jewish story. For her, there's a sense of resistance. It's how difficult it is to be writing in the shadow of so much and have to carry so much on your shoulders, when what we want as people, but certainly as people, as artists, as writers, is to be free, to be free to say what we will and mean what we will without having to represent so much past. Whereas with Epstein, the past gives him, I think, in a deeper a path, an access to something which he had lost in himself. So I think the question isn't resolved. The question remains open, like many questions in that book.
That's great. So this is the first collection of short stories that you published, right? To Be a Man.
Yes.
And it again, themes of identity, of needing to navigate one's way in situations of crisis or reckoning, existential awakenings, and run throughout that book. But let me ask, the title is very striking. It provokes questions like, to be a man, what? And I know it's the title of the last story of the collection. But could I ask why you thought this was a title that would best represent the collection as a whole?
Sure. I sense some doubt in your voice.
No, not at all.
I carry the same doubt with me. I've never known, until the very last minute, I was arguing with my publisher to call Forest Dark Gilgul, which is, from the Jewish concept of mysticism, the idea of the transmigration or the wheel, that the soul goes around, and they convinced me that was absolutely unacceptable as a title. So I come to my titles late, but I will say To Be a Man was in my mind somewhat early on, without having written the title story. I knew it was a title that I was driving towards with some momentum, even as I was writing stories that were, many of which are in this collection, about women, young women defining themselves against those things which wish to define them, middle-aged women, older women. And there are 2 stories out of the 10 that are narrated by, or at least told in a very close third-person perspective from men. I think this idea of to be a man, comes from many things. One actually is the fact that there is no woman I can imagine having ever really lived and thought deeply about what it is to be a woman, and how a woman, in whatever moment she's lived in the course of history, has been held back, limited, and contained by expectations and lacks of freedom. There's no woman who hasn't asked, what would it be like to be a man? To what degree might I have the right to rage, to anger, to cruelty, to imprecision, to lack of care, to loudness, largeness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that shadow question of what it is to be a man, it comes up, I think, for example, in the story, the husband, when Tamar is sort of talking about this man who has shown up at her mother's doorstep, and who, this agency claims is her lost husband, when everybody knows that, of course, he couldn't be her lost husband. Her husband is dead down the road in the cemetery. And yet he's accepted somehow into her mother's life. And she's just baffled by this. And she sort of quotes a friend of hers who says, there's no man anywhere who isn't so, whatever, that there isn't some woman waiting to accept him and take care of him with open arms. And she wonders, what would it be like if I could change and become, without all of the many endless forms of pain it would take to change? What would there, if I could change a man, would there be someone waiting for me like that? So there's the echoes of that there. And then next to that, separately from that, is the question, I guess, in some ways equally personal in my own life, of having lived now, half a life among men. I have a father, I have a brother, I grew up with many men in my life that I loved intimately, and friends and lovers, and I have two boys who are on the cusp of becoming men. They're adolescents now. And the question of all of that watching and observing of men, and as they've related to me, as they've related to other women in their life and men in their life, listening to their stories, watching the contradictions that both exist in them as they exist in all of us, but also the contradictions of what society asks of them, and the impossibility of ever answering those requests.
Yeah. In fact, I was struck by how much more difficult it is to be a boy than to be a girl at a certain age, by the first story and the last story of the collection. In the first story, the character has a daughter who is also the age of, I suppose, the older boy in the last story, around, what is it, 14?
Yeah, I think they're both around 13 in those.
Both around 13. But in the case of the girl, that the mother is astonished to see that she's already taking a certain kind of pleasure and delight in the power she can exert over men. Mm. No? And it's rather terrifying, because the story is about the memory of when she was in a boarding school in Switzerland and had a friend, more or less that age, who had an affair with a much older man. No?
Yeah, the friend is 18 when she has that affair. Yeah.
18, right. So this idea is that you can, being a girl, your womanhood is very self-assured in certainly in the case of this girl, whereas the son in the last story is actually in a state of tremendous anxiety and fear that this ultimate transformation, which is going from childhood into adulthood and from being a boy turning into a man, may never take place. And the mother has to assure him that your uncle had a spurt of growth, and don't worry, in 2 years you're going to be unrecognizable vis-a-vis what you are now. And I'm wondering if you can say something about this.
Sure. Yeah.
Kind of doubts that go with boyhood.
That's a beautiful observation. I don't think anyone's raised that. I think it has to do with my instinct to pay attention to the contra motion, which is to say that there have been a lot of stories, we absorb them all the time on television, film, and in literature, of young women who are victims of, very young women who early on in their first sexual experiences are victimized. And I wanted to write a different story. I wanted to write a story less told, but to me very familiar, which is what it actually means to be a young woman, and to use that theater, the theater of performing oneself before a man, sexually, romantically, as an act of assertion, as an act of self-definition, and a refusal of power that might be asserted over her. And that seemed to me more unusual. So that was the contra motion that I paid attention to in that story. And in the title story, To Be a Man, which is, the narrator looks at 4 instances in her life of men she's close to: her father, a lover who she calls a German boxer, a friend, Rafi, who's an Israeli and was a soldier like all Israelis, and then her 2 boys. And in the section of her boys, as you described, her older son is on the cusp of these changes, but he's quite terrified that to become a man is to lose his sensitivity and to kind of inevitably have this vein of violence open in him, or of uncontrolled feeling. And I don't think, again, I think we often read a different story. We read the story of just the leap towards that, or the, the sudden grappling with that, but not the sensitive fear of being overtaken by it. And so I think that's what interests. I never feel it's my work or responsibility to make arguments about human being, just to study the instances of it. And I felt these instances felt to me less studied.
Nicole, we have a few questions coming in, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I will start with one that goes back to this question of retrieval. And this is coming from Patrick Henry, a Marshall Scholar from the class of 1960. He says, on the matter of retrieval, Goethe's Faust remarks on one point, what you have as heritage now, take as task, and thus you will make it your own. And I suppose that this idea that you take the heritage as a task, and when you make it your own, that could be a way in which freedom could be well conjugated with inheritance and heritage, so that heritage is not just something that you submit to slavishly, but it's something that you freely reappropriate and make your own.
I hope that's been true of my work, and insofar as I am sometimes called a Jewish writer, certainly a writer who deals with Jewish themes, Jewish history, Jewish memory. I hope it's been the case that I have not dutifully recorded it, but have made it my own. But I will say that that's a wrestling that's not easy, not just in the realm of Judaism, but in the realm of any inherited set of religion or culture, things that we feel we are beholden to. And there's a section in Forest Dark which is about the binding of Isaac, and Nicole muses about this question of why are we bound? We're only bound so that we're bound to those who came before, and the knots and ropes go back all these thousands of years. But what about this possibility for cutting the ropes and growing wild towards the future? And that idea is echoed in a story in To Be a Man, which was written concurrently with that stuff in Forest Dark, which is called Zushi on the Roof, which is about Broadman, who's a historian of Jewish history at Columbia, and who grew up under his father's sort of, emotional, intellectual reign, and with a sense of absolute need for duty to Judaism and Jewish history. And at some point he realizes that his whole life has been torqued or deformed in this, in this feeling of needing to be responsible. And he nearly dies. He's, in his estimation, he's brought back to life. And while he's nearly died of stomach cancer in the hospital, his first grandson is born. And he wonders aloud whether it's possible for a child to be born without precedent, but that's what he wants for his child. And of course, that's an impossibility. But I think those two notions of in what ways are we bound, in what ways can we find freedom in the binding, which is always going, it's inevitable. Right. Is certainly at the core of these last two books, if not, and also Great House in many ways too, which is the novel that came before Forest Dark. That's
great. Yes, so just as another example, Beckett is certainly an important writer for you.
Yeah, very.
And I don't say that just because you took that class on Beckett with me, but because Beckett, there's the whole story about Beckett in Forest Dark, and clearly there's a big difference between imitating Beckett as a writer and freely appropriating him, as you have done, where your style is not Beckettian in any overt way, and yet that genealogy is very present in the penumbra of your style, and in the kinds of pockets of opacity that your characters don't shy away from, but descend into. So
I think he taught me, as other writers like Kafka did too, but a kind of the comfort with being uncomfortable, the comfort with uncertainty. You know, I still remember to this day that the class we had, one of the classes we had in Malloy, in which we spoke about that passage. I have it here, where Beckett, so this is Malloy is sort of limping around in the forest, and Beckett writes, when a man in a forest thinks he's going forward in a straight line, in reality he is going in a circle. I did my best to go in a circle, hoping to go in a straight line. And this, the absurdity of that, the kind of doing away with the, you know, sort of Descartes' notion of, you know, always sticking to the straight line and to the importance of reason. I think that's been a kind of subversive impulse of mine since around the time that you first met me. And I got, you know, encouragement from that, from people no less than, you know, Beckett himself and other writers that were important to me when I was young.
That's right. And that passage in Descartes' discourse on method, it's really an analogy for method. Method means metaodos from Greek, meaning being on the path. This idea that when you're lost in a forest, you shouldn't go this way or that way, but choose just one spot arbitrarily and go in a straight line. But as it says, many people think they're going in a straight line, they're going in circles. And therefore, that's also like a lesson for writers, that if you think that you're following a method by, you know, either through your creative writing or the kind of rules, that those methods can also lead you as much astray as lead you to that center of yourself from which that reorientation, that reconversion, that metanoia of the dark forest can actually take place.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's why I sometimes feel when I have these conversations and I'm asked how I wrote the books that I wrote and where my ideas came from, that I feel this kind of naivete rush up, because there's a refusal in me to have ever settled on any particular method. I don't have a method beyond putting myself in the way of accidents.
Right. Yeah, and that's why if you take the forest as our human condition, where we're always in a state of relative uncertainty, we don't really know what the future holds in store for us, and where life is always constantly asking us to adjust, you know, the path that we're on, because of things happen, contingencies, circumstances change. Then, you know, the challenge is not how you find your way outside of this forest of confusion and uncertainty, but how can you re-inhabit it in a way that you don't need a specific kind of method to take you outside of its boundaries. So that's great, Nicole, that's great. So there's another, it's not really a question, it seems more like a comment from Wallace Leslie. I have heard that Jewish men have a prayer that contains the line, "Thank God I am not a woman." If that is in fact true, what does that line have anything to do with your book?
There's some idea that line became codified when those prayers began to be printed with the advent of the printing press. And so and this is thought because they're in JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, in the Rare Books Library. I know, for example, they have a hand-scribed manuscript of a siddur that belonged to a young woman, and there the prayer is written, "Thank God, God didn't make me a man." And so that the prayer is said, it's almost the sense of being made for what one is rather than what one isn't. I'm not an expert on this, and I just remember being given a tour there and hearing that story, but that makes a lot of sense to me, which is not to say that there isn't Jewish law and as it's often practiced in Orthodox communities isn't rife with inequality, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah, great. Another one is coming from Linda Kinsler. Could you speak a little bit about your relation to Kafka's writing? I want to hear about that too. In Forest Dark, Nicole reads from parables and paradoxes, but the novel also seems to have something structurally in common with Kafka's parables, an embracer of uncertainty, but also of the impossibility of arrival.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
There's a long meditation in the book about Kafka and thresholds, and about forever being on the threshold and being unable to go beyond that, and the sort of both the possibility of that and the frustrations of that. Like Kafka as a poet of the threshold is an idea that I really love. I think, Kafka was for me, as I guess he may have been for many writers. He is for me the greatest writer of the 20th century, but he was also someone who I encountered as a young person and kind of opened up the way that maybe a strange uncle in the family, a kind of uncle that isn't like anybody else and doesn't fit in, opens up a path of being that otherwise wouldn't have been available to me. And it's not that, Kafka, it will forever be inimitable, but he opened up a path for some of us desperate to kind of live a little bit in the wake of what he did. In Forest Stark, though, I think my interest in him was, and my sense of his role in that novel was extremely specific. And that was when I understood that I was raising questions about the way that we form a narrative of self, and the way that narrative ingrained over time and retelling from the time we're very young can become too narrow. And the way that in literature and in art, we learn to grow or expand that narrative, that we have a sense that we have the possibility of multiple lives and multiple dimensions of being in the realm of art, but in the realm of our own lives, we don't really apply that, even though we know enough about neuroscience and memory by now to understand just how much of an invention our recollection of the past is, our construction of the self. And so I was trying to raise that, and Kafka, because the narrative of Kafka, as it's been handed down to us, is really written by one person, which is Max Brod. And, in the biographies, in the editing of Kafka, and what was salvaged and what wasn't, and in our sense of this person as a man, we have such a limited sense of who he was. And so even though when we go back and read those letters and diaries, there's an opening of a possibility of something else. And so I wanted to kind of use him as another, a third guide, a third Virgil, in a ghostly Virgil in Forest Dark, to say, what if we were to take this evidence and imagine the construction of a different Kafka, a Kafka who wasn't a martyr, who died, in Prague, but actually lived out these other lives. As he frankly has, Kafka has become immortal, really, hasn't he? Yeah.
On the level of style, one thing about Kafka and your style that I find that Kafka doesn't need to be obscure when he writes. His sentences, are perfectly streamlined and almost minimalistic, and there's no literary grandstanding, and you don't need the flourish that you get in, the Proustian sentence or something of that sort. And yet, for all the kind of semantic and grammatical clarity, there is this very intense opacity of the enigma or the mystery that he's dealing with, and one can't really penetrate into it. I think that the question here about the uncertainty and also impossibility of arrival is well said. I think at least my experience of reading Kafka is that I've given up the idea that I have to break the code somehow, because there's not a code that is going to finally open up to a transparent understanding of what these stories are. And I think your style also has this kind of almost Hellenic clarity, to use an Auerbachian thing about the Homeric style, is along with the chiaroscuro of the not the thematics, but what are these stories and books really about, and how they plunge into a kind of darkness that is not going to be illuminated either through either through concepts or through a different sort of stylistic flourish.
I think that sense of the preservation of the mystery is important to me, whether it's on the level of a sentence or where the sentence has to have absolute clarity, and I will slave over a sentence all day long, to get it absolutely right. But the moment that it leaps into rightness or liveness is not the moment in which it solves something, but the moment in which it wraps itself most perfectly around the mystery. So the mystery is contained, right? The enigma, as you put it, or the ineffable is contained there, and we can confront it or meditate on it, but not destroy it ultimately. And I think, you know, on a larger scale, that's what I'm trying to do in the novels and the stories. And I must say that I often encounter frustration on the part of some readers with that. And I understand it. We have a desire to squash things down into certainty and knowing for sure because it's safe. I think you write about this in one of your books, about the sense of knowledge. I think you're talking about Nietzsche, and you're talking about the sense of knowledge being a thing that makes us feel safe, right? Because
Yes.
we spring toward knowledge out of fear of not knowing. And I understand the need for the safety of knowing, but at the same time, I think so long as we can keep ourselves in the place of putting ourselves in front of the mystery, that's when we have the chance for real expansion.
Right. Well, indeed. And you know, when I was a graduate student at Cornell, I was very close with the poet A.R. Ammons, the American. He died a decade or so ago. And he said, he was lamenting that he was getting less attention than the John Ashbery's and others, because he said professors and literary critics don't have to do any work because my poems say everything that they mean to say. And they have this complete sort of lucidity, but that in the lucidity, it's like there's something inexhaustible that comes forward. It's like, you know, a sea, which is very clear, and therefore it can go down into a kind of impenetrable darkness precisely because it has that clarity, as opposed to a shallow puddle where you can shake the water, you have the muddy waters, it can be very superficial. That's where you have a Kafkaesque inheritance, I think, in your work, where you mobilize lucidity on behalf of the mystery.
Or as a friend of mine once put it to me, you really never make it easy for yourself.
Yeah. So we have a question from Todd Kettler. I would love to hear Nicole speak about her novel, The History of Love, how it shares similar themes to her more recent work.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I wrote The History of Love a long time ago. So I think I was 28 when I wrote it, or something like 28, between 28 and 30 maybe. I think, you know, when I look back on all the novels, I see that there's they're like photographs of my mind and feeling through time. And of course, there's a continuity of the things that concern me, the things that I have been wrestling with. But over time, the tone has changed, my positions have changed, my sense of structure has changed. I think, you know, The History of Love was so much about, I very much knew that I was writing something which I wanted to move people. And I think after that moved so many people with such resounding success, that I realized that I didn't need to go at it so directly. That, you know, we talked about this, Robert, the other day when we spoke briefly, that wonderful Rilke line from Archaic Bust of Apollo, where that imperative that he lands on, you must change your life. That sense of being moved, which arrives to us suddenly, but also comes over us very slowly, the sense that we must be different than what we are. We must change our minds about things. That can be a slow process, a slower process. And it doesn't need to come in so suddenly and so strongly as being moved to tears or moved to laughter always. Not that those things don't remain incredibly important to me. Laughter and being, you know, emotionally moved, that readers should be so in my books, but that I could take my time about it in a way. So I hope But, yeah.
That brings us back to the forest dark, which is a place of turning, changing, changing one's life, changing one's mind, changing one's orientation. And it doesn't have to happen only once. There are many different points at which you find yourself under the same imperative of changing.
Well, I think, the fact that we may be the only species that is aware of the fact that it is our fate to evolve is a difficult thing. But we know, as much as we want stability and need stability in order to survive and in order to feel safe, we know deeply in our soul that we are here to change.
Yeah.
That's
a good place. Since we don't have, we only have a few minutes left. Maybe I could ask you, Nicole, if you would mind reading maybe a page or two from the end of the story, To Be a Man, or unless you prefer to choose another passage.
I think that's a perfect way to end. Okay. So this is from that fourth section called Childhood. I'm just going to read the last page and a half, and this is the narrator who is kind of looking at and contemplating her two sons who are about 13 and 11. Enormous at birth, both are now so slender that their rib cages are visible under their skin, their shirts over their heads. I know everything about what is visible of their bone structure beneath the skin, and about the skin itself, the precise location of each beauty mark, and when it arrived, and the scars, and what caused them. I know in what direction the hair on their heads grows, and the way they smell at night and in the morning, and all the many faces they went through before the ones they each wear now. Naturally, I do. When the older one worries that he is too thin and weak, I tell him how my brother had been built the same way when he was young, until, without warning, like a storm comes so suddenly that someone, somewhere, must have prayed for it. A change came over him, that the thinness is in their genes, the sticks for arms, and narrow waist, and ribs poking out, all of it written into their bodies like an ancient story. But that sooner or later the time will come when this smallness and thinness will be overwritten, subsumed by mass, and the boys they are now will disappear, buried inside the men they will become. Your brother, he asks, trying to imagine it. My brother, who he once, but only once, saw in a moment of fury he failed to contain, pushed me across the room and threatened me with a fist. The small one is still too young to long to fall in love. He is surrounded by love, and that is still enough for him. The older one has already begun to long for it, but his body hasn't yet caught up with him. About this, he can still joke with me. For now, desire and the workings of the body are still subjects for humor. But as the months pass, something has begun to loom behind it, larger and larger. He is waiting for the changes he sees overtaking his friends and worries they will never come to him, that he will never desire the way others do. It's like a switch, friends who have boys tell me. One day it goes on, and after that, things are never the same. The door closes on one side and opens to another, and that's that. Another friend, a man, says that he had been a quiet reader all through childhood, and then between 1 month and the next, he began to throw chairs. This worries the older one too. The possibility that he will no longer be who he has always been, that he will lose something of his sensitivity, so valued by everyone who loves him, and that he will become capable of violence. When I go to kiss him goodnight, he curls his body into mine, and in a nervous voice tells me that he wants to remain a child, that he doesn't want anything to change. But already he is no longer a child. He is standing out on a bank between the shore and a sea that goes on and the water, as they say, is rising.
Oh, that's beautiful. That we're all somehow in that same water at any moment in our life, because that's what it means to evolve, change, and it's what it means to age finally too. Different stages of life. So I'd like to thank Nicole Krauss for, joining us for this conversation. And I'd like to thank Nell Breyer. I don't know if you want to make a last remark, Nell, before we close this session.
Sure, that was so wonderful. We are enormously grateful to you both. Thank you so much for taking some of your Friday afternoon. And to all of you who participated, listening and sharing your questions. We will post the conversation on our YouTube channel, and we'll circulate that link to all the event registrants. So if you would like to share that and you think there are people who would appreciate this kind of depth of thought and sensitivity, we welcome that. And please follow our announcements for future programs. We're not doing many, but we're doing them of this caliber, and we invite you to join us in the months ahead. So please be safe, take care, and thank you both again for taking your time. It was a wonderful reading and a wonderful conversation, and we hope you actually go out and buy the books if you hadn't had a chance to read Nicole's and Professor Harrison's. We encourage you to do so. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, Nicole. Bye-bye to everybody.
Bye. Thank you, Robert and Nell. Thanks so much.
Take care.